Nowish? Nowish? All right, cool. You know how hard it was to get a Coke Zero in this town? It's not real Coke. I'm diabetic. But thank you for that painful reminder of my lifelong disease. That's my brekkie right there. Yeah, my wife's ready to move here, by the way, everybody. She's been around practicing her accent, and all she knows how to say is wallaby. So now we're having wallaby for brekkie, and it's just getting really gross. All right. All right, cool. So my name is Scott, and check me out on the Twitter. What I thought I would do in this talk was to talk about how I think about the cloud. I'm going to use Azure as the example because, of course, Azure is one of the clouds that I work on. But the stuff that I'm going to show you isn't necessarily Azure specific. Most all clouds behave like this. Since there's a reasonably small-sized group, if you think that I'm talking about something and you think it's crap, or you disagree, or you think that the conversation should go in another direction, certainly feel free to raise your hands and we can talk about that because I think that it's important. This is one person's perspective. It's important to also give a little bit of context. I'm not a Microsoft evangelist. I've actually never worked in evangelism. I don't necessarily even like that word, evangelism, because it implies the Crusades. And like I'm walking around like, have you heard the news about Azure? Have you heard the news? Have you accepted Azure as your personal, yeah. So I've always worked in engineering, but the problem is that I'm just such an enthusiast. I'm a professional enthusiast that it often gets, it looks like marketing or it looks like sales, and that's not my intent. So the point I'm making is that I'm not trying to sell you Azure. I don't care if you use Azure. If you don't, that just means more Azure for me. The other thing that I want to point out is that everything I'm going to show you and all the different things that I've learned are done running real Azure websites with my money. Don't trust a Microsoft person who is running with an account that is free Azure. This is really, really important, and I'm serious about this. I pay for all of my Azure time with my own money, and except for a couple of MSDN credits, and if you have MSDN, you should hook up your Azure and get some credits. And the reason that that's important is that if you had unlimited Azure time, you would architect your Azure sites differently, wouldn't you? You'd make a large VM with super fast disk, and you'd leave it on forever, and you wouldn't think about it. But I have no money, and I don't like getting surprised. And one time I left a large SQL Server VM on for a month, and it cost about $1,200, and my wife was upset. So I have a whole series on my blog that's called Penny Pinching in the Cloud, where I talk about specific techniques about how to save as much money as you can with Azure. This talk has had a couple of titles. That was one. This is a good talk title as well. I think we can do that. Now, there's lots and lots of Azure diagrams that express all these icons and all these services. And one of the things that all clouds have a problem with, Amazon is even worse, is that they have a million different things that they could potentially sell you. And it's not clear how they fit into the stack. And each thing has its own like exquisitely designed icon. And there's actually this horrible slide that the Azure people show sometimes that is just a wall of icons, and then they drew colored boxes around it, and they go, Azure. And it's like, I don't know which one of these I want. Do I want Azure Batch? Do I want Azure Compute? Do I want Azure this or Azure that? So I made a simpler boxes and lines that expresses what I wanted to know. And the other stuff is just services and services as a service that you can use. So the way that I think about Azure is I go from the bottom up, and I think about storage first. I talked a little bit in the keynote about this idea that it's more than just lift and shift, right? In the old days, you would have a machine under your desk that would run a bunch of VMs, or it would be a physical machine. You would make a VHD, and you would then go to the host, and you'd say, run this VM for me. My blog runs at a host. I like my host. They think they're a cloud, but that's adorable. They're not a cloud. They're my host, right? Like they changed their name to a cloud later, but they're a great host. And I know that there's a physical machine that I could visit. Does that make sense? So when I think of a difference between a hoster and a cloud, I could visit my machine if it's a hoster. I could even roll a rack in. If I had a rack, I could drive it over there and plug it in. I could more specifically point to the hard drive that has my stuff on it. I could tell you that it's either 5,400 RPMs or it's 7,200 RPMs. And I have reliable disk access, and I know when it crashes. And I also know that I can remote desktop into that machine. So the one that runs my blog is a VM that runs at a host. With the cloud, whether it be Azure or Amazon, storage is this array of disks with this virtual file system kind of layered on top of it. And the virtual machines don't really have physical disks. Most of them don't have physical disks attached. They have mapped disks over fiber, over this custom storage backplane that are basically mapped to blobs of VHDs that are sitting in the storage system. Does that make sense? And that completely changes the characteristics of how these things perform, and it can be a little bit confusing to folks. One of the things that I like to do is I like to go over to is it computer management or disk management? I think it's disk management. Did you know you can go to disk management in Windows, and you can say, create VHD? A lot of people didn't even know that. They think of it as a Hyper-V thing, right? A VHD is a virtual hard disk that you can make and you can pass around. So you can go and create a VHD, and then you can mount it. And in fact, I made one here. Here's fancy.vhd. It is 25 megs, which is probably double the size it needs to be in Australia because it's going to take the whole talk to upload. But that's OK. That's going to be the talk, by the way. It's just me uploading this VHD and then declaring success. So I'm going to double-click on this. And notice that it immediately got allocated a volume E, and it's got a picture on it. Okay? It's a really good way to get files up to Azure. Is that of course you could FTP them up, or you could blob storage them up, or you could put them all into a VHD, millions of files, then take the VHD, upload that to blob storage, and then mount it. There's a really great article on Troy Hunt's blog about how he did that when he was doing some of the ingress of some of the security data that got pwned. The idea being that if I'm going to send you millions of something or hundreds of thousands of something, that's going to be a lot of back and forth negotiation. I could just stick it all into a blob and then mount it. That's one thing to think about. Now, this particular image is from a podcast that I did. So that's the podcast episode number 417. I've got this podcast that I'm trying to grow. I feel we're a little plateaued right now. It's a pretty good show, and I've been doing it for 538 episodes. And when I put this site up, I recently, maybe a year ago, changed the look and feel to, even though the thing is called Hanselman, I de-emphasized my face and tried to emphasize the faces of the people who are on the show. So I made this archives page that is just filled with these faces. And it looked great, and everyone felt that the site was good. But then I noticed a few things. People from Australia started to complain about this page. Any idea why? Lots of pictures, 540 pictures, in fact. It's a lot of HTTP requests. Okay? And my web app here, this simple little web app, ended up having this new page that is a 9 megabyte page. Right? Because it works great in Portland, right? It was naive design. I took a website that ran great at a host, and I threw it up into the cloud, and I figured it would be fine. And this machine runs in Chicago, and I didn't even think about it. So there's a couple of multi-leveled things that I can do here. I'm using a thing called the Azure Storage Explorer. You can actually go to storageexplorer.com. This is free. It's a really great tool. It's actually written in Electron, as apparently everything is now. And it lets you go and connect to Azure. So I'm going to go and click here to Hanselman onto blob containers and images. Okay, and here are the images for the shows for my podcast sitting up in Azure Storage. Now, I show this to people when I'm talking to like user groups. I went to the Portland Linux users group, and the average age of the people there was 65. They're always thinking at every sentence, so what? Right? That's how old people work. So what? I was FTPing a long time ago. You've done nothing but reinvent FTP. Right? But I point out that with storage, cloud storage, S3, Azure storage, when you put a byte up there, that byte's being stored in 3 different places, right? And if you do like locally redundant or geo-redundant, it can get multiply redundant across multiple places. When I upload something to my host via FTP, those bytes go over the wire and they sit on a platter, and I can visit that platter and I can kick it, and now those bytes are gone. But with Azure or with S3, that stuff gets spread apart, and you are supposedly guaranteed that you can't hurt that, right? It's like free RAID in the cloud. But it's even more than that, because if it were just RAID, then it would be like, well, there's 2 or 3 or 5 disks on a platter in a particular place, and if that place burned down, I'm still going to lose those bits. Azure is smart to load balance things not just apart from each other in geographic sense, but they can even keep machines away from each other on different rows, on different power, on different stamps within larger Azure data centers. So if part of the Azure data center perhaps blew up, you could be rest assured that the software balancing of the system is going to keep that in another location. So awareness of that is important. So I threw all of my images up there, and I thought that that would be useful. But then I realized that this isn't really a web server, it's just storage. I could put a couple of zip files up there or torrents or whatever, and I could use Azure to serve those things. But what I really needed was a CDN. The CDN gets backed by Azure Storage. So again, think about this. Even though I didn't put the CDN here, it's just one of those many icons, it's going to sit on top of Azure Storage. So you put your files in Azure Storage, you go into Azure, and you check a box, and you say, I want a CDN. And it goes, where is it being pulled from? And you say, there. And now you've got a CDN. So that gets then copied again. So you've got your locally redundant storage of my images. And then I said I want a CDN, and now there's an Australia copy, and a Southeast Asia copy, and a Japan copy, et cetera, and it gets to be out in the CDN. And then it ends up showing up in some kind of a crazy URL like, here we go, name of my storage thing.blob.core.windows.net / whatever. You've seen those before. You've even seen these URLs before from Microsoft properties. I think that's sloppy, because that advertises the underlying stuff. I don't want to give free advertising for the underlying stuff, right? So what I want is images.hanselminutes.com, right? And this is such an obvious thing. We've been talking about this for 20 years. Hey, put your images on another place. Hey, use a custom cname. Don't just use your own CDN, brand your CDN. These operations in the cloud, these are 10 and 15-minute long things. It literally took me 15 minutes to go into DNS Simple, which is where I host my DNS, and add a cname, go back into Azure, tell it about the new name. I waited for an hour, and then it was done. And I got that. But you'll go to big professional, like Woolworths or whatever, and you'll view source, and it's just a mess of DNS lookups. It's really surprising how sloppy people are. So right now, this comes from the CDN, so it's fast in Australia. But it's not always about the cloud, right? It's not always about the cloud. Do you need to load every image on this page? No, exactly. So you stick this, you do some client-side work. Let me scroll really fast. You see that? What's happening there? I only load the images that are in the viewport. So in fact, I've got this great rich page full of faces, but we're, in this case, only seeing the ones that enter the viewport. Nothing to do with the cloud, but solved huge problems of outgoing bandwidth, because you get charged on the outgoing bandwidth, and you don't get charged on the incoming. So ingress is free, egress is expensive. So I was actually it was costing me, $15 a month to serve this page. And then I added a little bit of JavaScript. You can go and view source there and check it out. And this suddenly became a more responsive page. It became a page that was cheaper for me and that would work better whether it was in the cloud or whether it was hosted somewhere else. Does that make sense? It's just a little bit of thought ahead of time that I'm continually surprised that people don't do. Now, I could go and take this VHD, rather than dragging images one at a time if I wanted to. And I could go up to Azure and copy that into Azure Storage and then mount that VHD. Let's log into the portal. Now, the portal has been like an ongoing bit of chaos. It sucks way less than it did last year. If you've hated the Azure portal, and I did, believe me, it just sucks less, you know what I mean? I think it's, where did I put it? I think it's over here. The couple of things that they've done that make me happy. This is actually written in Knockout.js. It's a big HTML5 application, and Steve Sanderson, one of the main architects on this, is here. So if you can see him talk, check it out. If you hit question mark, they added keyboard shortcuts like Gmail. So you like go to virtual machines and things like that. That makes life a lot easier. This dashboard here is entirely configurable. I can go and drag stuff around. I can resize things. And just recently, they added multiple dashboards. So you can go and say, show me cost, and then have dollar amounts for all the different things, or show me bandwidth out, or show me uptime. You can lay this out any way you want. So we've actually been encouraging people to set up like inexpensive 42-inch TVs, put them in the lobby of their place, and you come in and you see the dashboard. You can also show it to the boss, and then they can see server health and all that kind of stuff all from here. They've also added, of course, full screen, and on my Surface Book here, I'm doing the little thing we stole from Mac, which is the 4-finger swipe to explore that. Now, let me go to storage. So this is scrolling left and right here. So here's my storage account, okay? We can see the requests to the storage account as we've been messing around. And I'm going to click on Files. Oops, not Files, Blobs, pardon me. You can do file shares now, like Windows file shares. So here I've got fancy.vhd, and then I've got these other ones here, like see this MySQL data disk? These are different ones that I've named and different ones that got made for me. I wanted to make a virtual machine, and I wanted it to host MySQL because I was doing this newsletter. And I didn't know what I was doing. I ended up making 2 virtual machines because, again, I didn't know what I was doing. I made a Windows virtual machine, and I put MySQL on it. And then I made a Linux virtual machine, and I put PHP on it. And it hosts this newsletter application that I use. And if I go over to the virtual machines, you can click Search now and find everything and go straight to it, which is a lot easier. And I can go straight to that virtual machine. Or I can, of course, do this action over here. So this VM is Windows, and I can click Connect, and it's going to download RDP and automatically pop in, and I'm now going to remote into this MySQL virtual machine. When I put this one together, I did it very naively. If I go over to my computer, I started out with this default disk. You don't have to see too close there, but just there's this C drive, and I created the VM, and I installed MySQL, and I was like, hey, this is cool, and it was slow. I was like, this sucks. Wow, Azure sucks, the cloud sucks, and I was ready to leave. And that's a very common theme with the cloud. But then I read, and this is the other thing that I'm finding that people don't do these days with the cloud, right? I mean, if you think about it, aren't we optimized for the first 10 minutes? Like, no matter what it is, right? You go to Hacker News, like, show Hacker News. I built a thing. We worked on it for 6 months. I couldn't get it working in 10 minutes. Sucks. It's crap. Same thing with the cloud, right? You know what I mean? There is what they call the pit of success, where you want to be able to fall into success. But a little bit of reading actually turns out solves a lot of problems. I had my database and my Windows stuff on the same drive, on the C drive. And you have a maximum number of IOPS. I think it's 500 on a small virtual machine. So Windows and the disk and this database were fighting. Well, then I went and read the docs, and it turns out that you can have multiple disks for free. Moreover, the bigger the VM, the more disks you can have, again for free based on the size. So a small gets 2 VHDs, and a medium gets 4, and then 8 and 16, right? So if you remember in the keynote, I was talking about the problem where they were spinning through all of those TIFFs and going and OCRing them. Imagine if you just said, I'm just going to make a giant VM, I'm going to upload a whole bunch of TIFFs and throw them in the temp folder, and I'm going to for each over them, right? You're going to be limited to what the disk can do. But same price, not changing any cost. If I found out that was a large VM and I could do 16 disks, if I did the yellow pages style sharding, right, you know, A through L, M through Z, and then split it up across 16 disks and then ran 16 processes on each of those different things, I'm going to get literally 16 times more perf doing it asynchronously rather than doing it synchronously, and it wouldn't cost any different. But people will go and do the first solution, declare that the cloud sucks and it's slow, and then go off in ignorance. So this is what we're trying to get people thinking about. I'm sure you already are thinking about this. You're a smart-looking crowd. But I want you to take that message as an example back to the folks at work that are making that knee-jerk, oh, it sucks, kind of reaction. And think about that, because sometimes it's just willful ignorance, or in my case, it was just like regular old ignorance. What I ended up doing was I made another disk, MySQL data, again, for free, because it only costs what it costs to store the disk data. Now, again, ignorance, I made it 5 gigabytes in size, because I figured it would never need to be any bigger. But it turns out that, and also I didn't want to pay for the storage, right, because it's like pennies a gigabyte. It turns out that it's charged on sparse storage. So I could have made it 100 gigabytes, but if it was only using 2 or 3, I would only pay for 2 or 3. So when you go and say make new disk in Azure, you should just always make it as big as possible. There's no reason to make it small, unless you need to download it to Australia. So then this thing gets fast. Suddenly it's double the speed. Costs me no additional money, and it gets double the speed. I then remote into it and discover there's another disk. There's a 20 gig disk here. And it turns out that that disk is physically attached to the thing. There's a scratch disk that's attached to virtual machines that is a real spinning Rust disk that isn't storage, but it's temporary. So then I change my temp variables and things like that, and I throw it over onto there, and then things get faster again. When I have batch work that isn't durable batch work, I can do it on that disk, and it's like 10x faster. So that simple realization that, A, I can have multiple disks, I can do things in parallel, which is a very different way of thinking about it, right? If this was a machine running under my desk and I had a disk on it, I'd think, oh, it sucks, it's slow, get a faster disk. The obvious thing isn't make 16 disks, right? It isn't run down to PC Micro Center, buy 16 disks, and put them in an array. But it is literally that easy to do that in Azure in a batch file. Even more, you could just theorize that it might be faster and experiment, and in 15, 20 minutes, answer the question, is it faster? So this, in my opinion, is the difference between the host and the cloud, right? With the host, you would fax them a note that says, hey, plug in 16 disks and let me know if it might be faster. But with the cloud, I can do an experiment. Hey, might it be faster with large or extra large? I don't want to spend the money. Well, I'm only going to use it for an hour or 2 or 5. Do it. Try crazy stuff. There's a virtual machine in Azure that's called the Godzilla machine. That's all SSDs, all local SSDs, and it's like $3,000 a month, which sounds really overwhelming, but you just use it for an hour to do your test, and then you tear it down. So that just-in-time usage is really, really important. That scratch disk turned out to be very, very useful. Now this is that Windows VHD. VM rather. I've got another one, which is this Linux one, and they work together. And what I'm going to do is bring up Bash. Anybody upgrade to Anniversary Edition, the dumbest name of Windows ever? Couldn't they just called it 10.1? It's got Bash now, so this is Ubuntu, which is cool, and it has top, which is nice. And I'm going to go and I'm going to SSH into that machine, which is my Azure VM. That's that machine. It's weird, I'm running Windows, running Ubuntu, SSHing into Ubuntu, running on Windows Azure. So, and then running top. So this is the machine that is running up there. And this particular one, let's do htop because it's prettier, is running one app for me. Now, when I made this app, with this VM, containers really hadn't happened yet. This was a couple years ago, so the whole Docker kind of craze hasn't happened yet. But the idea of a VM as a single tasking container is still a valid one, even if you don't want to think about containers. And by that, I mean you could make a large VM and fill it full of applications and make it very dense. Or you could make a bunch of tiny VMs and put one application on them at a time. Then you only have to deal with the keeping them updated, right? Like as I said before, apt-get update on the puppy. This is the smallest or the extra small VM in Azure. Notice that the memory is 670 megs. And even this is too big. The tiniest VM in Azure is fine for my newsletter application, which means it might be fine for your expense reporting app or whatever. But I send out my newsletters maybe every couple of months, so then this isn't enough for a day or two every couple of months. So I leave it like this, 99 times out of 100, and then for a couple of days, I upgrade it to a medium, it does its job, and then I bring it back down. Does that make sense? Penny pinching in the clouds. This cost me $7 a month to run this. Now, the pricing calculators and stuff on Azure suck. I mean, it's just, you go into the slider bar and you say, well, I think I need this much, and it looks expensive, and then you leave, and then you never come back, right? But people think about the amount of headroom that they need on a VM or on a web server the way that they used to think about it. I used to always keep the CPU under 50%. That's what we've been told all through the 90s, right? It was like, oh, it's 30, 40%, it's running pretty hot. Something could happen, and we wouldn't be able to move fast enough. We wouldn't be able to get that machine up fast enough. I say you should be running your VMs hot. Get them working. If it's not working, what's the point? You don't get charged for 60% CPU differently than 30 or 90. If it's working, it's working. If it's up, it's working. So in this case, this machine is doing nothing, but it is a single tasking machine. It is an extra small. It is the $7 version of Azure. In the future, I would move all of these workloads into Azure Container Service and have it handled by Docker, and then I wouldn't even have to think about logging in occasionally. But the point is, I don't think about headroom as much. I try to run these things at maybe 80% CPU and about 80% memory, and if they go hotter than that, I scale them up. That's how we save money in the cloud. Does that make sense? One thing per VM. So these are still virtual machines. And by the way, again, all of this is configurable, and you can even right-click on this particular thing. So here's the CPU percentage of this individual virtual machine, and I can then pin that and lay out this however I want to. So here's the CPU percentage. I can go and say edit and lay it out any way that I want. And it even, they recently updated it for giant monitors, so you can go vertically now and do 30-inch monitor and these great dashboards. So it's good. But that is still virtual machines, which have their place, but sometimes stress me out a little bit. By the way, how long does this talk go till? 11:20? 11:20 tomorrow. All right, so just another 23 hours. That'll be fine. Let's go back to this slide. This is why I don't do virtual machines, virtual desktops, because it's somewhere here. There it is. Now, there was this thing called worker roles, and then it was called cloud services, but it's this thing that is not quite websites or web apps, and it's not quite virtual machines. If you think about the problem of a virtual machine, it is maintenance. Once you go file new, it's your problem. but you want full control. So how do you find the balance between I want total control but no responsibility, right? Or the website, which is I feel like I don't have any control at all because I can only do this one thing. People usually look at websites or web apps that are platform as a service, the purple one up there, and they say it's far too constraining. I have no control. I can't see what's underneath it, but I don't want the responsibility of a virtual machine. So they made this thing called cloud services or worker roles, and the idea is, what if you have a virtual machine that is stateless, that can come and go without warning, and you have full control over it. So when it starts up, they go and they inject whatever code you want onto it. They run your setup scripts. They get it all ready. And they could have 1 or 3 or 5 or whatever. They automatically have them come and go. But you can't store any local state on that C drive because the disk will just disappear. All of your work has to happen somewhere durable. And where is that durable place? Storage or queues or whatever. Make sense? That was really confusing to people. Because you think about what we just said, right? It's like a virtual machine, but just pretend it has no disk and you can't ever write anything to it, and you have to go and change all your code to not write to the disk like it used to, but to write to this weird Azure SDK thing that you don't understand. So people kind of reject it. For those people who read the docs, they built giant things like the Harry Potter Pottermore system, which scales to hundreds of these virtual machines and manages millions and millions of users, things like Halo, like major big systems. But it is in this weird state. For most people, I believe, websites or web apps is the way to go, and the way to go because you actually have more control than you realize. It's not just do a git deploy and this thing shows up. So let's do a git deploy and see what's underneath it though real quick. So let's go out here. I might have like other, see I already have another folder called Super Fancy Pants. So that one's empty, and I'll say .NET New Web, okay? So now I've got a .NET Core web app here, and I'll type Azure, which is the Azure command line, okay? And I will say, just to make the point, Azure site list. And that's going to go and make a JSON call, the exact same RESTful call that the dashboard makes. We don't get to call any secret API, so that's really important. Another cooler way to look at this is you say Azure site list --JSON to see the underneath. See that? So that's all the other stuff that you could potentially get. So if you don't like some aspect of it, write your own, your own front end. So Azure site create Super Fancy Pants 3 -- location. I don't have access to Australia East, so I'll say Southeast Asia -- get. So getting sites to see if someone else created Super Fancy Pants 3. They did not. Getting locations. Hopefully that's the correct location. Creating a new website at superfancypants3.azurewebsites.net. Sending site information. This will probably take an hour. Don't worry. We'll be all right. Okay, initializing remote Azure repository. Getting user information. A new remote Azure has been added to your repository. Get remote show Azure. And internet, right? So there's a Git repository up in Azure right now that's empty, that's waiting for me to do something about it, okay? So then I'll go git add git commit, hey, git push Azure master. And that's going to start pushing that up, right? Because Git is FTP for code. So see where it says remote? Azure's doing that. Now, while this is happening, I am going to switch over. It's building in the cloud now. I'm going to switch back over to here. And we're going to go to App Services. And we called it Fancy Pants. You see how, this is subtle, but you see how there's different things that are going on in here where it's automatically scrolling correctly? A lot of the annoyances of the Azure portal have gone away because they know what you want to keep in the portal. I'm spending a lot of less time moving around. You saw how I was able to get exactly where I wanted to go very quickly. I hit App Services, I typed fancy, I clicked on it, I was there. Okay, I could have done it with the keyboard as well. Now, I'm going to go and say Tools, Log Stream. Oh, are they going to turn those on for me? Application log. This usually gets turned on automatically. You can turn them on in Diagnostics Log Settings. You can actually go and see a bunch of stuff inside of here. This is Super Fancy Pants 3 that's automatically uploading. That will turn on in a second. What I wanted to show you was that these things that are happening here can be, that is part of the log spew. You see it says remote : It's not happening on my local machine. The remote is doing it. So in a minute, when log streaming turns on the other side, I can go and see that. Now notice here, restoring packages, D:home. I don't have a D drive, right? That's the D drive that's happening up there. So they're using a thing called Kudu, which Kudu, K-U-D-U, and this is an open source tool that you can run as well. There are people who have taken it off of GitHub and they run it internally. It's the thing that listens as a Git repository on the other end, collects all of your stuff, builds your code, runs a deployment script, and then puts it into IAAS. That's what Kudu is. Isn't that cool? So this kind of style of deployment was popularized a number of years ago by Heroku, right? And now everyone does this. So I have a Git repository locally. I added my stuff to it. I pushed it up to the remote. Here, it's automatically, look, see, C:/DWAS files, sites, Fancy Pants 3 app data. It's going and it's running NuGet up there. And we also are doing mirrors of NuGet and NPM such that we don't have to go all the way out to those sites. We'll go and grab them locally. We're also working on making this faster. Notice that there was some work happening on D, home, site, etc. And then there was some work happening on C. We can change those deployment scripts, and you can too. You can totally write your own deployment script to optimize these deployments for speed. This one is not currently optimized for speed, but if you watch the ASP.NET community stand-up, we discovered that and started working on it, and we've gone between doubled and tripled the speed of this by making sure that the NuGet packages that are coming down and then the compiles that are happening on disks that are local rather than in storage. Does that make sense? Because we're on real hard drives. We're doing platform as a service, but there is a VM there. You just can't see it. What I'm trying to show you is that you, in fact, can see it. There's hints. There's a moment there where it said C, and there's a moment there where it said D. So I can go back over to, while it's still doing that, to here. And let me see if the log streaming is going to work. I can turn it on later, but I want to see it. Yeah, it's still turned off. I can click console. Now I'm inside of Chrome here, okay? There's nothing tricky. But look, I'm in Chrome on D, and I just did a dir. So I know that there's a VM out there somewhere that is handling Super Fancy Pants for me, and it's D, home, site, www root, and hosting start. You know when you visit an Azure page and it shows you that blue thing that says this site has not yet been created? That's the file. Now you don't need to like revel in that or anything, but just that moment where it's like, oh, well there would have to be a file on a disk somewhere to do that. It just makes me happy when it's like, oh, that's how it works. You know, it's like when I watch that video on YouTube that shows you how a limited slip differential works in a car, and you go, huh, and then you just forget it for the rest of your life. But there's a moment there where you feel comforted. I feel comforted when I see stuff like this because I realize that like Azure isn't this crazy foreign thing that I don't understand. It's like, oh, there is IIS. Oh, it is Windows. Oh, there is a D drive. Now I'm hitting dir. Notice how this is empty, right? What's going on? Why is it empty? It's empty because this work here is happening in a separate place, because it wouldn't make any sense for us to do all that build in place in production, because Kudu is going to get it all ready and all perfect, and then it's going to swap, and those files are going to instantly show up. Some of the other things that Azure websites can do that is really significant is doing, see, look at that. See? So there's my DLLs. Deployment successful. So now I can go and say Azure Site Browse, which will launch the browser because I can't remember what the URL was. It launches Edge, but you can't win them all. So that's hitting that particular website, .azurewebsites.net. The very first time, it'll do a little compilation of the Razor pages. Plus, I think, there you go. And now there's my deployment. So, yay. So other than the fact that it took 3 or 4 minutes, which is too long, I mean, I would like it to take 90 seconds, but we know why, right? We know why. I can go back over to here, and I can poke around at the console, and I can do stuff, and I can even run Git, right? Like, this is HTML, but it's a reminder that this is a real computer, and I can really do stuff with it. Let me see why my log stuff isn't turned on. Diagnostic log set. I'm going to take a moment of your time and experiment here. This turned on yesterday. Application logs are switched off. You can turn it on, diagnostic log settings. OK. These are all the different kind of settings you can set. Here's another example of people doing stuff without thinking. A lot of people say, well, we need 64-bit. Got to get 64-bit. Remember the thing we talked about a minute ago about density, right? 64-bit for little applications, it does nothing. It's a huge waste of time. Additionally, that slider bar, right, that Azure slider bar that helps you with pricing, it's very confusing. Looks like this. Azure Pricing Calculator. Sometimes I just visit it because it just is so bad. They've changed it now. Web and mobile, app service, view estimate. Here we go. Well, this is better. So number of instances, $55 a month, and I go, that's too expensive. And then I leave, right? But they've also got this one called shared that they don't advertise for $9 a month, and suddenly things got better, right? When you are figuring out how to do things in the cloud well and cheaply and densely, you got to think to yourself about what do they offer. For $10, you get a gig of storage and a half gig of RAM. But you get a shared core, which means you don't get a dedicated CPU, right? You share your CPU with others. So what can you do with that? You have minimal CPU, but you have a lot of RAM. You can cache a bunch of stuff. So my podcast website, when I used to go to the database on every page call, it would exhaust the CPU, and then it would get shut down for 5 minutes, and Azure would say, no, you know, you're not important, you're not on the super premium plan, we're going to pause you for a while. You know, you've seen that when you go to an Azure page, and it's like, this one's really, you know, hit its quota. But then I just cached everything in memory, because it's a balance. Like, what is the resource that they are giving you, and how can you architect your app to save you money? Okay? So I cached everything in that half gig of RAM, and things got better. That one is $9 a month. But then you go up to basic. And what they don't do, in my opinion here, is tell you, do they bury it in here? Yeah, this sucks. So that means that you have one core, 10 gigs of storage, means a dedicated processor, and almost 2 gigs of RAM. What they don't tell you is that you can run as many websites as you can fit in there. I've got 19 websites that are running in one standard. I'm not going to pay $55 a website. But as soon as I figure out that an app service, what it is, again, you have to read the docs, there's this thing called an app service plan. And then you can go and add these websites into these plans. And then if you go and do a standard, which is what I ultimately ended up doing, within standard there are other subgroups. So for $75, I can have 1, 2 cores, 4 cores, but you get SSL and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I basically run everything except my blog, all of my properties in one standard. Does that make sense? Then I just have to go and keep track of the memory usage and make sure that things are working out okay. So if I go back here and show you my actual sites, these are all different sites. You see here it says West US, see it, default server farm. All of those are in the exact same place. Let's look at this one here. This is in Resource Group West US, default server farm, standard small. Okay, look at this. I'm keeping my memory at 60%. CPU is very low. None of these sites do much, right? These are small cached sites. For me, I didn't want to be going to the disk all the time. So a little bit of code that would go in cache, like with the podcast. Do I need to go to the database every page call? No. I just put in simple caching code that said, go to the database every 4 hours, and that's freshness, was 4 hours. Even freshness checks of 5 minutes. You have to ask ourselves, what is real time? I used to work at a DVD reseller, and they would insist it has to be real time. Your inventory has to be real time. It doesn't really. 5 minutes is real time. 10 minutes is real time. That's real time enough. And doing that can completely change the scaling characteristics of your application. So here, I can go down and say scale up the app service plan, and then go and say, medium or whatever, or I can go and scale out, and that's where you get your web farms. This is cool because now I can go and do it manually or automatically. I can auto scale. So if suddenly someone gets, I don't know, we don't get slashdotted anymore. What do we get? Reddited, or we get Hacker Newsed, right? Or Scott Guthrie tweets you or something. I haven't got that set on because I'm only at 60%. But the other fear is that you're going to wake up the next morning and it's going to cost you $1,000. That's the other fear about Azure. So in this case here, if I got reddited or slashdotted or whatever, the site would either become unresponsive or would go away, and then I would get an email. I can actually show you some of the emails that say, your CPU has been over 80% for the last 5 minutes or whatever. You can set those alerts up yourself. So you can be alerted if it's going to be a problem, or it'll automatically scale. But then you can max out where it scales. You can say, well, I only want to max it out at 2 instances and no more, and I don't want to pay for anything more than that. So with this Kudu thing, let me show you a trick. We had, that page was at superfancypants3.azurewebsites.net, correct? There it is. I'm going to go and change that URL. And I'm going to say .scm, source control management. I'm just guessing. We'll say that that's what it means. It's going to try to log me in. And now, look, I'm at this magic hidden page. I like web apps, websites, because I know that there's a VM, but I never have to remote into it. I never have to run updates, but I still have power. Okay? And when I got here, I realized exactly how much power I had. Every Azure website has this sidecar website. You have this site. You may not even know it. You can click on Process Explorer. Check this out. There's the website there. There's the sidecar above it. And there's .NET. Running my .NET Core application. I can then go and say properties, find out exactly where it is on disk. I can see how much memory it's using. I can download a memory dump from production. Right? And you're like, I don't want to use web apps. I don't get any control. Go here to modules, see the exact versions of what got loaded into memory, in case there's any concern. The exact versions of the DLLs. This is Entity Framework coming from a particular location. I can confirm that it is, in fact, the RTM or the released version of that, in case I was maybe concerned that there was an older one. Okay? But this is the best part. Because it's the cloud, you see where it says REST API? I'm going to click on Processes. Now, this looks like crap. So let's go and turn on JSON View. And then hit refresh. This is a RESTful API. I'm hitting /API/processes/the PID, right? The process ID. Okay? And let's look at the .NET one. That's live. I just made a RESTful API call to see that .NET process. I can see the states of each individual thread within that process and debug that stuff. Isn't that cool? So think about this from a validation perspective. You could write code that could go and assert your assumptions of your websites that would then go and say, make sure that everything got updated to such and such a version, or that that DLL is correct, or are you still seeing problems with that thread being stalled, et cetera, et cetera. You can do that programmatically. You don't always need to remote into a machine to have a great deal of power with it. These are just process REST APIs, but you can go farther to see individual deployments. You can confirm the SHA hashes of those deployments. And there's also an oh crap button. My son's here, so I wouldn't say it the other way. There's the, like, oh, they've made a mistake button. So like if an evil person went and did a deployment, you can just hit that button and swap the deployment back. Additionally, because we've paid for that basic or the standard app service, I can have sidecar sites like Super Fancy Pants dev, staging, production, testing. I can have slots, deployment slots. And we can go over into the Azure portal, set up the, where did it go? We can go and make those deployment slots. We can do all of that programmatically if I want to. And then we can actually do A/B testing in production. So you could basically say, I want you to do 10% of the traffic to staging, 90% to production, and then over time, ramp that traffic up, and then if it looks bad or an error occurs, bring it back down. Now, this is really significant if you think about it from a small business person's perspective, because, again, in the 90s, there were people whose whole jobs, whose entire companies were to do what we now think of as being simplistic A/B testing and ramping of traffic between staging and production. And now one person can do it with a slider bar in the cloud. Now, again, you could do this with VMs, but I just want you to understand that it's more than just git deploy. It's more than just not thinking about web apps. It's about all of these things as a service that you could do. So last demo, this isn't even actually on the list, but I want to show you this because if it works, it's kind of a neat demo. This is my iPhone. Let me see if I've got this app that I want to show you. 1 second. It'll be worth it. Don't leave yet. Almost done. Talking to myself. It's all good. Oh, the internet here is so good. I'm going to go ahead and get off the internet here and go and spend my data plan, my valuable data plan, on you people. Oh, the App Store, such a piece of crap. Hang on, hang on. There it is. Let's see if this works. Okay, so my buddy and I made a startup called My Echo because we have iPhones and we like our iPhones a lot. And Siri is really good at dictation, right? And Cortana doesn't do dictation yet. So we wanted to make it so you could talk to your iPhone and have the text show up here. Now, if I click hub.myechoapp.com, it's going to say North Central, probably because I'm VPN'd into work. But I've also got Southeast Asia and in Europe. So that's why it's saying North and Central. Some of you will hit that, and you probably, depending on what network you're connected to, see differently. I'm going to hit Try It Online. This is the only valid reason to use a QR code. And I just scanned it with my iPhone here. See if this is going to work. Your connection was lost. Do I have a data plan? This is embarrassing. Good Lord, the internet here, you guys. Let me try this again. Trying another Wi-Fi network. So basically, comma, I just talk to my iPhone and make sure to use punctuation, period. It's hashtag awesome, period. So this is me and another individual. We made the app with C# and Xamarin. We send the stuff up to Azure. But we have servers in 3 different regions. We have a backplane, which is the Azure service bus. If you go to hub.myechoapp, you see our internal debug thing. That's using Azure Traffic Manager that automatically picks the fastest location based on what it knows about your machine. And in my case, because I'm VPN'd into Redmond, it picked North Central. Again, you'll get Southeast Asia. If I'm in Japan, I'll get Japan. And that effort was minimal. When I went to Japan to demonstrate this, it took me a half an hour beforehand to fire up the Japanese arm of our startup, which is me and this guy from Brooklyn. It was really, really easy. So if you think about the layers of abstraction that we're dealing with in the cloud, the idea that 2 people could have a little startup to go and do something like this and have it just work and have it work globally and look like a real company is really significant. And if it gets popular, like for example, we got written up in a German newspaper and we started seeing errors. And I use this tool called Raygun. Have you ever used Raygun.io? Absolutely brilliant. They're out of New Zealand. They're fantastic. And Raygun started sending me notifications about exceptions that it was getting. I log in and I scaled the site up. Now we have the site set to auto scale. And then when we were popular in Germany, we had 2 instances over there, and then we scale it back down. And that Azure is handling it all. So I think that's pretty cool, comma, that's my demonstration of the cloud, comma, let's do some Q&A, question mark? Thank you. So we are down to no time at all, but we got, David here's got the microphone. If you have any questions, you want to have any thoughts or anything? Was that useful? Was that okay? Tell me that was okay? Okay. Now I feel better. Now I can sleep at night. Yeah, and no questions at all. You're just going to sit there and think about it and stroke your beards thoughtfully. Yeah? All right, thank you all very much.